Rampage Jackson is back.
He is back in town.
He was one of the most violent knockout artists of his era, a man who could lift another human being off the ground and drive him headfirst into the canvas with no hesitation. But the man Rampage Jackson hated the most wasn't the one who hit him the hardest. It wasn't the war under the bright lights of Las Vegas. It wasn't the brutal knees that left him unconscious in front of a screaming crowd. It was something far worse. Back in the early 2000s, inside the cold silence of the Saitama Super Arena, fights didn't feel like sport. They felt like survival. The canvas was stained before the main event even began. Fighters walked in knowing they might not leave the same. Soccer kicks, knees to grounded opponents, no protection, no safety net. Rampage walked into that world as a destroyer. But one night, the crowd went quiet for a different reason. Not because of a knockout, not because of blood, but because they were watching something far more uncomfortable. They were watching a man lose control, lose his power, lose his identity. And for Rampage Jackson, that moment never really left him. Because long after the fight ended, the feeling stayed. Before we begin the story, we need to understand who Rampage Jackson truly was. Quentin Rampage Jackson was born on June 20th, 1978, in Memphis, Tennessee. He did not grow up dreaming of becoming a polished martial artist. He grew up learning how to survive. Memphis in the 1990s was not a place where anger disappeared. It built, it stayed, it followed you. And for Rampage, fighting was never just competition. It was an outlet, a release for something deeper that had been there long before he ever stepped into a ring. He found wrestling in high school. That was the first time his aggression had structure, the first time violence had rules. But even then, there were stories, street fights, confrontations, moments where control slipped. Rampage was not a technician. He was a force trying to learn discipline. When he entered mixed martial arts in the late 1990s, he did not arrive as a complete fighter. He arrived as a problem. Raw strength, explosive slams, a style that looked chaotic but felt dangerous to anyone standing in front of him. By the early 2000s, Pride Fighting Championships in Japan became his battlefield. Inside those rings, under bright lights and silent crowds, Rampage built his name the hard way. Not through clean victories, but through wars. He became known for something very specific: the ability to take punishment and then respond with something violent enough to change the entire fight in a second. His slam against Ricardo Arona in 2004 was not just a knockout. It became one of the most replayed moments in MMA history, a reminder that 1 second of power could erase minutes of control. But that reputation came with a cost. Rampage was not just fighting opponents, he was fighting pressure. Injuries began to stack. Training camps were brutal. Weight cuts were dangerous. And outside the cage, the attention started to change him. Fame did not calm him down. It amplified everything that was already there. There were moments where the line between fighter and man began to blur. Legal issues, emotional instability, decisions made outside the cage that reflected the same chaos he brought inside it. And through all of that, one truth remained. Rampage Jackson was never a calculated champion. He was an emotional fighter. And that is what made one particular loss hit him harder than anything else. The violence that made him famous also changed him forever. Number 5, Chuck Liddell. Before the UFC crowd ever embraced him, before the belt, before the mainstream fame, Rampage Jackson had already tested himself against one of the most dangerous strikers of that era. In November 2003, inside Pride, Rampage faced Chuck Liddell. At the time, Liddell was already known for his knockout power and his ability to end fights with a single mistake. The matchup was simple on paper: striker versus brawler, precision versus chaos. But what happened that night told a different story. Rampage did not hesitate. He closed distance aggressively, absorbed shots, and imposed his physicality. He slammed. He pressured. He refused to give Liddell the space he needed. And eventually, he broke him. Technical knockout. It looked dominant, but that was only part of the story. Because years later, in May 2007 at UFC 71, the narrative flipped. This time, Liddell was the champion. This time, the fight was in America. And this time, Rampage walked into a different kind of pressure. The rematch was not just about skill. It was about redemption. Rampage knocked Liddell out in the first round. Clean, violent, definitive. He took the UFC light heavyweight title that night. To the audience, it looked like closure. But for Rampage, it never felt personal in the way people expected. There was no deep hatred toward Liddell. No lingering psychological scar. Just competition. Two fighters trading moments across different eras and promotions. They hurt each other, They tested each other, but they did not break each other mentally. And that distinction matters because as we move deeper into this story, we are not looking for the most famous rival. We are looking for the one who left something behind. Number 4, Wanderlei Silva. If Chuck Liddell was competition, then Wanderlei Silva was something else entirely. This was not just a fight. This was survival inside the most brutal version of MMA that ever existed. In July 2003, at Pride Final Conflict, Rampage stepped into the ring against the most feared man in Japan. Wanderlei Silva was not just a champion. He was the symbol of violence in Pride. Relentless pressure, endless aggression. Knees that didn't just hurt, they ended careers. From the opening seconds, the difference was clear. Rampage tried to push forward, tried to impose his strength, but Wanderlei did not back up. He never backed up. He met him in the center and turned the fight into chaos. Clinch exchanges, dirty boxing, knees to the head, again, and again, and again. By the second round, Rampage was no longer dictating anything. He was surviving, and then it ended the only way those fights could end in that era. A barrage of knees, a body that could not respond anymore, technical knockout, but it did not stop there, because in October 2004, they fought again. Pride Shockwave. Same arena, same result, only worse. This time, the damage felt heavier. The control felt more complete. Wanderlei didn't just beat Rampage. He broke his rhythm, took away his aggression, forced him into hesitation. And that is something Rampage rarely showed. For many fighters, 2 brutal losses like that would turn into hatred. But for Rampage, it didn't. Because deep down, he understood what Wanderlei represented. That era, that brutality, that level of pressure. It was not personal. It was just reality. And as painful as those losses were, they still weren't the ones that stayed with him the longest. Number 3, Ricardo Arona. Not every moment that defines a fighter is a loss. Sometimes, it is the moment right before losing. In June 2004, at Pride Critical Countdown, Rampage Jackson faced Ricardo Arona, a fighter known for control, discipline, ground dominance. The complete opposite of everything Rampage represented. From the beginning, the fight followed a pattern that felt uncomfortable. Arona did not rush. He did not brawl. He did not engage in chaos. He slowed everything down, took Rampage to the ground, controlled position, neutralized power, minute after minute. Rampage wasn't getting hurt, but he was being erased. That was the real problem. For a fighter built on aggression and impact, control feels like suffocation. There is no explosion, no moment to release, just pressure, constant, quiet, unavoidable. By the middle of the fight, the direction was clear. Arona was winning, cleanly, methodically, and then something happened that changed everything. Rampage, trapped on his back, did something that didn't make sense, something that didn't follow technique, something that came purely from instinct. He lifted, in one violent motion, he picked Arona up and slammed him headfirst into the canvas. Knockout, immediate. The crowd exploded. It became one of the most iconic knockouts in MMA history, a moment replayed for years, a reminder that 1 second of chaos can rewrite an entire fight. But that highlight hides the truth. Before that slam, Rampage was losing control. He was being handled, managed, reduced to something predictable. And that feeling stayed with him longer than the knockout itself, because it revealed something he didn't want to face. That power alone wasn't enough, that there were fighters who could take everything he had and make it disappear. Arona didn't break him, but he showed him how close he could come to being broken. Number 2, Rashad Evans. By the time Rampage Jackson faced Rashad Evans, the violence had already changed. This was no longer Pride, no longer the silent, cold arenas of Japan. This was the UFC. Bright lights, cameras, promotion. Words mattered almost as much as fists, and Rashad Evans understood that better than most. Their rivalry didn't begin inside the cage. It started on The Ultimate Fighter. Coaches, opposite sides, constant tension, small moments turning into bigger ones, conversations turning into arguments. Then came the words, interviews, press conferences, subtle disrespect that slowly became direct. Rashad questioned Rampage's discipline, his focus, his evolution as a fighter, and Rampage responded the only way he knew how, with emotion. This wasn't like Liddell, this wasn't like Wanderlei, this felt personal. But even then, something was different, because underneath the anger, there was structure. This was a fight built by promotion, a rivalry amplified for attention. Yes, there was real tension. Yes, there was ego involved, but it followed a pattern, one that the modern era of MMA had already learned how to create. When they finally fought at UFC 114 in May 2010, the buildup had already done most of the damage. Inside the cage, Rashad stayed composed. He didn't brawl, he didn't get pulled into chaos. He used wrestling, control, distance. He took Rampage down, kept him there, round after round. And once again, Rampage found himself in a familiar position. Not knocked out, not destroyed, but controlled, neutralized. The fight ended in a unanimous decision, clear, undeniable. But what lingered afterward wasn't hatred. It was frustration. Because deep down, Rampage understood what had happened. This wasn't a war. It was a strategy. And as much as he disliked Rashad, as much as the buildup made it feel personal, it still wasn't the one. The one who stayed in his head. The one who made him feel something he couldn't shake. Number 1, Kazushi Sakuraba. The man Rampage Jackson hated the most didn't knock him out. He didn't break his jaw. He didn't leave him unconscious on the canvas. He did something worse. He made him feel powerless. In July 2001, at Pride 20, Rampage stepped into the ring against Kazushi Sakuraba. At that time, Sakuraba was already more than a fighter in Japan. He was a national symbol. The man who had defeated the Gracie family, the one who represented technique over size, patience over aggression. And that night, everything about the fight felt different. The crowd wasn't reacting to violence. They were waiting, watching, studying every movement. Rampage came in the way he always did. Forward pressure, physical dominance, the intention to overwhelm. But Sakuraba didn't meet him with force. He absorbed it, redirected it, slowed it down. The fight went to the ground. And that was where everything changed. Rampage wasn't being hurt. He was being controlled. Position after position, transition after transition. Every movement he made led to another trap. There was no explosion, no space to reset, no moment to use his power. Just silence, just control. And then the finish came. Rear naked choke. It wasn't violent, it wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, and that was the problem. Because for the first time in his career, Rampage couldn't fight back. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. That feeling stayed with him. Years later, when he talked about losses, about rivalries, about fights that mattered, it wasn't always the knockouts that came up first. It was moments like this. Moments where a fighter realizes that strength doesn't matter, that aggression doesn't matter, that everything he built his identity on can be taken away. Sakuraba didn't humiliate him with damage. He exposed him with control, and that is a different kind of scar. Not one the crowd can see, but one the fighter never forgets. Rampage Jackson built his legacy on violence. The slams, the knockouts, the moments that made crowds stand up and lose control. That is what people remember. That is what history chooses to replay. But for the fighters who lived through that era, the memories are different. They don't remember the highlight. They remember the feeling, the exhaustion after the fight, the silence in the locker room, the moments where something inside them shifted and never fully came back. For Rampage, it wasn't the hardest punch that stayed with him. It was the night he couldn't use his power, the night he couldn't fight the way he always had, the night he realized that violence alone was not enough. Because in that moment against Kazushi Sakuraba, he wasn't a destroyer. He was just another man trying to escape, and he couldn't. That is the difference between pain and something deeper. Pain fades, but the feeling of being powerless, that stays. That becomes part of you. The crowd remembered the slams. They remembered the knockouts. But Rampage remembered something else. A quiet moment. A controlled fight. A loss that didn't look brutal, but felt heavier than all the others. And maybe that is why the man he hated the most was never the one who hit the hardest.